Today we're going to talk about sort of 3 simple changes that drastically improve my D&D games, and I think that these are going to be really helpful for you. So there's not a lot of preamble. Thanks for hanging out, checking it out. If this is your first time here, hey, nice to see you. Think about liking, subscribing. We're going to talk today about 3 things that I think really helped my games improve, and they're also really simple things to implement in your game for the most part. One of them's a little weird, but we're going to get into it. So those 3 things just right up on the top, we're going to talk about morale, random encounters, and effort. Without any further ado, let's just go ahead and jump into it. So let's talk about morale first. So this is one of those things that really struck a pain point for myself early in my sort of dungeon mastering career in general. Like I kind of say usually in these videos, is like we're kind of focusing in specifically on D&D because that's most people's entry point and what most people are familiar with, especially sort of behind the screen as a dungeon master rather than a game master, storyteller, keeper, whatever your preferred system calls that role. All these things are going to be pretty useful for any game that you kind of run, especially if it's got combat stuff in it, because that's really where morale is going to sort of take off. Though you could use morale in other instances, and perhaps we're going to talk about that, so stay tuned. Let me see if this sort of sounds familiar to you. You've been sort of running a combat, and it seems like it's taking forever. I think that we're all familiar with those very long, especially D&D combats, up to an hour, and depending on your edition, up to like 2 hours to do one combat. And that's a lot of time sink. And the problem is that if you've experienced that, especially if you've experienced it multiple times, you can feel sort of the energy of the table kind of go down. And it does get kind of boring, and it kind of drags down the game. So my solution to that was a solution that's actually an old solution, not a new solution, which is to basically re-implement morale, which is a thing that used to be in D&D and then kind of got pushed aside. And so I sort of ended up bringing it back, because now it's bring back an old mechanic that allows combats to be cut off sort of at the end. And so what does morale sort of look like at the table? And it's for most of us, it's going to be a very sort of strong sense of self-preservation for your monsters. And it does a few different things. It shortens combat, and it adds this sort of sense of verisimilitude, which is more reality kind of idea, that it creates these new, more interesting combat results that kind of changes from the sort of default that D&D kind of pushes people towards, either intentionally or unintentionally, which is that you have 2 sides, they come together in a combat, you guys roll initiative, you start this combat, and you go back and forth until one side is completely wiped. It's like 100% wiped out. That's okay in some circumstances, but that's not very realistic. It's certainly not fast. And it's not particularly interesting. When you get into it and when we feel that energy drop is when we bypass that sort of tipping point where it's unsure which side is going to sort of come out on top. Once assured that, let's say, the player characters, the party is going to win this combat. It's clear, they've used their spells, they've done everything, and at this point they're basically just spending turns chipping down hit points from monsters with these sort of bloated HP stacks. And I know that there's a lot of augmentation that kind of happens in the D&D space where people are like, oh, well, you just take the monster hit points and cut them in half to sort of speed up combat. But another easy way to do it that doesn't require you doing some prep math is to implement this sort of morale system that helps sort of figure out a point when monsters are going to be like, you know what, I don't think I want to be part of this combat anymore. I think this is going poorly, and I don't think I want to be here. When do we sort of implement morale? And for me, morale is for most combats. Really any combat that has sort of thinking creatures that have some sort of sense of self-preservation, accepting things like constructs, undead, low-level elementals, or zealous creatures, or creatures that are serving sort of a higher purpose. That could be devotees to a dark god for their ritual, in which that thing is more important than their individual life, because they have this higher purpose. They are more than willing to sort of give up their life for that sort of higher power. It also could be sort of protecting something that's more important than their individual life. It's the same sort of things that we see with monsters that are protecting their young, their children, they're protecting a nest. Those are sort of creatures that have some sense of duty, that they are protecting something that's more important than themselves, is because they're protecting the whole of a group. Or like I said, they're protecting something like children who aren't able to defend themselves, and so they're trying to exchange their life for that in some way. So it works for most combat. So, you know, your standard sort of like bandits, drows, displacer beasts, beholders, illithid, any of these creatures who are very selfishly motivated, which means it works especially good for villains, because they are very, very sort of self-motivated, and they are focused on their self and their own success, and they can't be successful if they're dead most of the time. I mean, unless they're a lich, I guess. But we're not going to talk about liches. We're going to talk... And a lich is still going to run. Well, a lich might not run. I guess it depends on the phylactery. I think we're getting off topic. Let's get back on topic. How do we sort of implement this very straightforward morale check? So morale checks for me, if you've watched the solo RPG, you watch me do tons and tons of morale checks. What I do is I roll a 1d20 check, and sort of the DC for that check is generally the creature's charisma, though in some cases you do have characters that have bloated charisma, where if they have a very high charisma, it could also mean, especially if you're using a flat 1d20 check, that you might not make it. Like, it might be impossible to actually make that check if they have above 20 charisma. So usually it's either charisma or intelligence. They have enough sort of self-preservation, and their nerves get to them, and they lose their mettle and get out of combat. Or they're smart enough to sort of recognize that, hey, this is not going well. If I stay here, I'm reading the situation correctly, I'm probably going to die. So I'm going to get out of here. So you can use either one of those two. Usually I use charisma, though, because most monsters, especially anything that's not sort of a thinking humanoid creature, generally has really low... I mean, they have low intelligence, too. But they generally have a very low charisma. And so anytime that I basically roll above their charisma, they're out of here. And it's very easy. They try to leave combat, and they could leave combat by leaving the area of combat. And that could be fleeing... That could be going to get reinforcements. There are all these other things that they could do. They could be trying to hide. Sometimes they'll just try to parlay. Like, if things aren't going well, they'll try to stop the combat and see if they can get out that way. Or they will try to surrender. And then that puts the player characters in a very interesting sort of situation where they have to decide, these guys have surrendered. What are we gonna do with them? Now, I don't know about you, but most parties that I've played with over the years, other than, weirdly, myself, I don't think a lot of people usually carry around things like manacles. And so you're either going to give up your rope to tie people up, in which rope's much easier to get out of than something like chains or manacles. Somebody has to watch them, they can get away. That just happened in our solo RPG stream, if you've been watching that. We had the last guy in a fight surrender to us. We basically captured... I don't even think we tied him up yet. We captured him, we were kind of looting over the dead bodies. We got drawn into another combat, and as the player characters turned to focus on this new threat, the guy just kind of snuck off in the back. And he's in the wind somewhere. Now, what that does for us is that is going to get sort of right into our next point, because this person took flight in a dungeon, and that means that there's a likelihood that they're going to alert other people in the dungeon, the sort of bad guys in the dungeon, to the party's whereabouts and where they are, and that they're actually there. So, which means that when we were doing things like rolling for random encounters, which we're going to talk about, that now we're doing it sort of with advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you want to phrase that. Either way, it's more likely that we're going to run into a random encounter because the inhabitants of the dungeon have been tipped off to the party and where they are and what they're doing. And who they are, so it's very easy for them to sort of identify them. So there's always a chance that if you let people go, there's a higher likelihood that you're going to run into more combat. So it kind of puts... The players have to make some more choices, they have to think a little bit more tactically, they have to consider about how they want to go through a dungeon, but of course this also happens in Overland too. It doesn't necessarily always have to be in a dungeon. We do lots of sort of hex crawling stuff where morale's very important, for any of those sort of skirmishes that happen in the overland journey sort of area of the game. But yeah, that's it. So morale has really helped me because it really sort of took those combats and really sort of smushed it down, because generally at about 50% health, or about 50% of the bad guys being removed, at the start of each turn they start making morale checks. And again, I just roll the d20 against usually their charisma or intelligence, and then if check passes, they lose their medal, and they decide to take off or surrender or whatever they're going to do. They're going to try to stop fighting at that point. I think D&D works really well when it hones in on about 3 rounds of combat. That seems to be about the sweet spot for me that I've seen sort of in my experience. And that's not just a 5th edition thing, that's like across editions of D&D, is that 3 rounds of combat is about the sweet spot. And so I really don't want to push combats any further than that. And I could go in beforehand and like cut hit points in half, but that gets really weird because that doesn't account for things like crits from the player characters or any sort of damage resistances. It gets wonky and it's a lot of extra prep stuff. So for me, the most simple and effective solution to sort of put into that situation was to start implementing morale. And that's really helped my games, and it adds this sort of sense of realism to my games that I don't find, I think, in a lot of other DMs games, where it's like, hey, if the PCs rock up and just start obliterating people, these random CR 1/2 guards are not going to stick around. Your bandits are not going to stick around. Your goblins are not going to stick around. They don't have that discipline. Now, you might have creatures that have, like, hobgoblins that are a lot more disciplined, or combat veterans, things like that, who are more inured to combat, and they're a little bit more hardened, right? They're not the sort of like tenderfoots. They're going to be able to sort of probably stay in the mix there, and I might give them some sort of bonuses, or I might decide to change where I decide to start making those morale checks, kind of based off of the specifics of that creature. But for most creatures, it's usually about 50%. Either 50% of their friends are gone, or 50% of their hit points are gone, and they're trying to get out of there. So that's sort of the first one. That's sort of morale. So I also want to talk about, and it kind of dovetails into that second one that I kind of talked about, random encounters. So random encounters leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And that's sort of understandable. So let me kind of talk through how I sort of flipped the script, because I was definitely on that side, and then something sort of clicked for me and that changed. So let's kind of talk about for that process. If you're running games, you run into issues where you have players that are kind of stalling about making a decision, parties that keep trying to take short and long rests in very dangerous areas. They're doing sort of like over resting, even if they're doing clever play and they're sort of maneuvering around sort of your planned encounters, or they're finding ways to sort of circumvent things, and oftentimes that can leave you in a spot where you don't necessarily want to punish them for their clever play, but you start looking at what you've prepped for the session. They're getting like ahead of the prep, and they're getting beyond it, and you're like, oh, now I've got to sort of scramble to improvise stuff to the end of the session. So this is one of those things where random encounters kind of pull that in, can kind of be a time sink. What exactly is random encounters? So random encounters, the nomenclature is a little weird, and I think that's where most people get the sort of distaste for it. They're like, random encounters. The biggest sort of reprise you'll hear about that is like, oh, it doesn't really further the story, right? It's not sort of furthering the plot in any meaningful way. It feels truly random. There's no sort of reason for this to be happening. I like wandering monsters as a better sort of name for it. Again, this is another thing like morale that used to be a core and central part of sort of D&D and the play style that kind of fell out of favor. Contemporary D&D's editions do a very poor job of telling you what it's there for, like why it was there to begin with. Even the sort of the standard 2014 D&D Dungeon Master's Guide tells you a lot about like how to do random encounters, but it doesn't tell you a lot about what they're for and why you should be using them. So it took a long time for it to sort of click with me as to like what it was for. Random encounters in general, they sort of provide these sort of new unexpected challenges. It helps to keep things interesting, and sometimes they can be kind of overused. When it's like, oh, well, you're traveling over land, so obviously you must get into some sort of random encounter. But that's not generally what it's used for. The way that I use them, the way that it really made sense for me, like why should I be using random encounters? Why should I be using wandering monsters? Is primarily, the first and foremost, is to basically unstuck players. Sort of remind them that they are not in a safe location. Let's see if this sort of resonates with you. If you have like a puzzle room or something like that where the players are kind of staring at it, or they're at a fork in the road or whatever it is, and they're kind of having a discussion about which way to go, and you feel that discussion starts to get circuitous, like they're sort of going around in a circle, and no new information is being presented, there's no new sort of arguments, the argument seems to have lost its sort of steam towards a resolution. An argument, discussion. We'll say discussion. It could be an argument. I don't know your players. It could be an argument, but I'm going to assume that it's a discussion. They're stalling out in the game, and you're looking at your watch or your phone time, and you're like, all right, we only have this sort of finite amount of time to play our D&D session, and I don't want to spend most of that here sitting watching you guys not do anything. And I think that this is a very gray zone, especially for newer DMs, because there is a lot of goodness as Dungeon Master, as a game master, to be sit back and let the players entertain themselves and just kind of listen. But the moment that stop seeing like they're having fun, like that they are making forward progression, that's sort of like what is you need to recognize as like, hey, I need to step back in and sort of prompt them to move on. And so that's what we're talking about by basically kind of unstucking players. And so one of the things that I like is like a puzzle door, and they're having a hard time figuring it out, and you don't feel like they're making any forward progress. It's like, then one of the things that I'll do is that I will sort of telegraph that, hey, there's some monsters coming. I'll start rolling dice. Sometimes that's enough. Watching the DM sort of pick up dice and roll dice while the players are having a discussion that the DM's not part of almost immediately draws their attention. They're like, wait, what are you doing? Why are you rolling dice? And then you can be like, you can do the thing where you look at your dice and go, oh, interesting. And sometimes that's enough. And they'll be like, all right, well, we can't figure out the puzzle door, so why don't we move on? If not, then you can sort of telegraph things that are coming. Where you start talking about, oh, well, you start hearing voices, or you start hearing footsteps or movements in the passages beyond, or you see torchlight flickering on the wall far down in the corridor where the T intersection is, coming in your direction. Is getting brighter and brighter. And sometimes that's enough to move them around. And then, like, if they don't take the warning shots, then you just bring the encounter to them and be like, okay, well, you guys screwed around, and now you have to go through this fight. So that's sort of one of the easiest ways to do it, is to basically kind of unstuck them, kind of add a little bit of pressure to them to kind of force them to make a decision, to kind of get going, to do something. This also works anytime that the players get a little too comfortable with their current situation. When we talk about 10-minute workday, which is an old time, it doesn't come up that much in 5th edition, I feel like, but it's certainly in previous, like 3rd and 4th edition, came up a lot more, where it's like, players have an encounter, they use their abilities, and they want to immediately take a rest so they can get their abilities back. Random encounters work really well for like rolling for random encounters when they decide to rest, because you have to remind them that, hey, you are not in a safe area. You're not in a safe haven. You're not in a town. You're in the middle of a dungeon. You're not home invader. You're not going to get sort of like 40 winks in somebody else's home without them probably finding you and probably being very upset with you. And given that we're talking about monsters in general, I mean, they're probably going to try to kill you, or at least try to get you out of their dungeon. So think about it from that aspect. So it's a reminder that, hey, don't think that you're in a safe location, because you're not in a safe location. And that kind of dovetails into the next thing, which is whittling down resources. So many times that you see online, especially, Dungeon Masters sort of lamenting that, like, they have really, really struggled to challenge their players. And this one, random encounters dovetailed with, like, complements morale really well, because it allows you to have shorter combats, but allows you to have a lot more combat in a D&D session. Sometimes, depending if I'm running a dungeon, it's not unusual for me to have upwards of 5 or 6 encounters in one session, just because they're quick. They get in there, they do their thing, the PCs do some damage, they leave. Especially once the players start to understand morale, they know, hey, if we do a bunch of damage really quickly, most of these creatures will just go away. Gives them sort of incentive to use spell slots, things like that, use their sort of class abilities, things like that. So you can whittle down those resources, and then as they go through the dungeon or they continue on their adventure in between rests, they have fewer and fewer resources, which makes the combats that happen harder and harder and harder, even though I'm not actually inflating the difficulty of the encounters as we go along. It's just that you have to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it, and as you keep doing it, you lose more and more of your resources. which inherently makes combats more difficult and makes the choices more precious in those combats and what you decide to do, actually inside and outside of combat. And as I sort of started to grok that, dungeons became a lot faster. I also run shorter dungeons, so I think this would probably be different if you were going to run like sort of a big sort of mega dungeon, but for relatively short dungeons, I mean, we've seen it over in my solo RPG series, if you want to go check that out, is that the players really struggle find a place in their current dungeon that they're in right now, a place to actually take a long rest. They had to find a very well-guarded place that the monsters seem to be avoiding. Of course, we found out that's because there's a vampire in that crypt. We dealt with the vampire, which we were not really prepared to, and then we took the long rest in there because everybody else was avoiding it because they knew there was a vampire in there. So we dealt with the vampire and then did it. But that kind of shows you how difficult it is. So taking a 1 hour rest is okay, but trying to take like an 8 hour sleep rest is... Man, that's really difficult to do in a dungeon, because the last thing you want to do is try to take a rest and then get interrupted in the rest and have to start trying to take the rest over again and have to do all the checks again. Usually when I'm doing the overland, like I do in the solo RPGs, I roll a d12, and on a 1 there's an encounter, and when I roll a 12 there's some sort of like wilderness dressing. Usually it's a non-combat encounter, so usually come across some other sort of like travelers, or some sort of interesting thing, maybe find some forage resources, things like that. But in the dungeon, we kind of bust that down, and it's basically you rolling 1d6, which is very old school. That's how it's done in the old school ways. If you roll a 1 on the d6, a random encounter happens. So the longer you guys dilly-dally in the dungeon, the more you screw around, the more time you guys take to search the rooms and loot bodies and check for secret doors and compartments, and if you're spending a lot of time searching for traps on the floor or things like that, all that takes time. The more time you spend in the dungeon, the more likely it is that monsters are going to find you because they're wandering around the halls. Which means you're going to get into more combats, which is going to whittle down more of your resources, which is going to make you need to rest, and it's very difficult to rest in the dungeon. It's sort of this sort of spiraling down of consequences of trying to do too much, too slowly. So it kind of pushes this area where playing needs to be fast. You need to go through dungeons very quickly. Try to avoid fights whenever you can if you don't see like a real big sort of reward out of it. Or you want to ambush them and take them out really quickly. Steal anything that's out in the open that seems valuable. If you're pretty certain that there's something worthwhile stealing or hidden in a specific room, then it's worthwhile searching for. It may or may not be worthwhile searching the bodies of just standard mook enemies, because you're probably going to get like pocket contents, you're not going to get a lot of money or anything like that, and there's more chance you're going to run into more monster encounters. So it started to click for me, and it allowed me to sort of take back control over the difficulty of the game. I feel like I don't struggle now like I did previously, and I know a lot of Dungeon Masters struggle trying to challenge the players, because the players are so powerful, especially as they get higher and higher levels. And it seems counterintuitive to be like, well, I'm going to throw more combats at you. And it's like, but they're actually going to be smaller, faster combats, but they're still going to whittle down your resources. And so you have to make a decision. It's like, am I just going to use specifically cantrips in this fight? Or am I going to use leveled spells, because that'll trigger the morale, and we'll get through the combat easier, so we'll lose less hit points, things like that. So now there's all these interesting decisions for the players to make, even down to, you know, people playing like fighter classes, like, do I use my ability now? Do I protect the spellcaster? Do I let the spellcasters do their things? Do I do my action search now? Do I wait to do it for maybe a more potent encounter? So it kind of gives them a lot more to sort of chew on, which now it's a much more engrossing game. So like I said, I roll a d6 on a 1, the random encounter. I try to telegraph some sort of warning shot that, you know, monsters are coming first, or if you can avoid those combats before they happen, or if you accidentally get ambushed, or you can just head straight into the encounter. There are ways that you could positively want to use random encounters. If you want to make sure that they've missed some sort of vital clue that you need to give them, you can always have some sort of neutral creature show up to kind of tell them about that, or to have a combat and then one of them has a note in their pocket that kind of gives them that clue that they're missing, or that they've made some sort of weird wrong assumption about, like, correct in universe, rather than having to stop the game and be like, hey, actually that's not correct, that is not what's going on. For me, it's always better to try to do that within the narrative of the game, rather than sort of like step out and talk about, sort of out of character, talk about, hey, sorry, you guys missed this thing, it's really important. So we're just going to retcon that you had it. So now I want to talk about effort, which is the third thing. So let me see if this sort of pain point kind of resonates with you. You've had probably rogues or bards who vaults a non-combat challenge or obstacle too easily with a single check. You're like, oh, there's this 16 DC. Convince the guard to let you in. You're going to try to do like a little deception. And the bard rocks up and they're like, oh, how about a 27? You're like, okay, yeah, you guys get through. They can be really sort of deflating. Deflating it certainly as a DM, but also it feels like it steals some of the fun out of the game when you can distill everything about a certain challenge down to sort of a single die roll. And so effort was something that really helped me try to figure out how to add a little bit more meat and potatoes to that. So we're not trying to undistill it, if you will, to try to make it a little bit more cumbersome, a little bit more noodly, a little bit more engaging than there's this thing, you roll a die, you pass, we move on to the next thing. Now, don't do it for everything, but for things that are meant to be more obstacles, more challenges, these are especially useful for those hot challenges I talk about. Those are hazards, obstacles, tricks, and traps. Those sorts of things that you kind of want a little bit more staying power in your D&D game. My solution was to use effort, which is a different way basically to incorporate the idea of skill challenges. So skill challenges were something that kind of came out of specifically 4th edition. Kind of took that and then modified it quite a bit so it does the same thing but doesn't quite look the same. And this actually comes from Index Card RPG, which is up there on my shelf. Runehammer, I think he was talking about it in a video long before the actual game came out. What it does is that it kind of sets a sum of DCs that need to be reached within a sort of timed window that has a consequence for failure. That may sound very abstract now that I'm saying it out loud. So we want to add that meat and potatoes to sort of the bare bones of what especially 5th edition D&D gives us for non-combat sort of exploration challenges. Social challenges, yes, but more specifically exploration challenges. So often those are sort of boiled all the way down to just a singular saving throw or check. So the idea is to create a larger scenario out of that encourages all the PCs to participate and come up with clever attempts for their way to sort of help in that, because it's not something that can be boiled down to one character making one die roll. When do you kind of use these? I primarily use them in dungeons, but you can use it for overland challenges. You can use them for social scenes too. Once you start to understand it and understand how to use it, you can be like, oh, well, I want this to take more than one turn, so this sounds like something I would use effort for. How do you kind of do that? So you determine your DC just like you would normally. Let's say it's like a DC 13, like arcane firebolt trap or something like that. That's like got a pedestal with like a big fiery orb on it, and then as you guys walk into the room, it shoots firebolts at you. And you're like, okay, so this is a DC 13. I want to make it to be more than just like, hey, it shoots one at everybody and they deal with it, and that's the whole thing. So I'm gonna put this pedestal in the middle of the room, and it's going to have this orb on top of it, and it's going to have its own initiative. We're going to treat it like a combat, and then I'm going to take that DC 13, I'm going to multiply that by, let's say, 5. So they need to make some sort of checks that equal 65 or greater to shut off this sort of orb, to like deactivate the orb. And I don't personally care what they do to do that, as long as it makes sense. Remember, it fires every round at everybody. So when it's its turn in initiative, it's going to shoot at everybody. So you want to do this quickly. I might even change it, instead of making it like a firebolt thing, it's going to be like magic missile. So that you're just going to take straight damage until you guys deal with this. So now it's something for them to sort of engage with and kind of tell them, all right, so this thing keeps happening. It's a very complicated sort of mechanism. Maybe the fighter just runs up and attacks it. Maybe that worked. I'm probably going to get some DR on damage, something like that. I might just use their attack bonus, whatever their attack roll is, and subtract that from the 65. And then the rogue's going to run up and do their sort of disarm trap check. We're going to reduce that from the total. So it kind of works like hit points, kind of. So you can do this from anything that's like a pit, to crossing a river, to trying to break through a barricaded door, that in any of those kind of things that you want something that's going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with than just one check, and also not something that as straightforward as we're just going to hit it with our weapons till it dies. So if you want something that's not either one of those things, then this effort works really well for that. So we had the rogue run up and do their disarm. We had the fighter just try to straight up attack it. There is a cleric, and they might play more of a support role in this, and that's fine. The characters can always support one another. Maybe they'll use the help action on whoever's next, some sort of wizard or something like that, and they're trying to dispel the arcana on it, and so the cleric's trying to help them or give them guidance, and then they make their sort of arcana check to interpret the runes that are on the pedestal to scrub them out and deactivate the thing as well. And so now everybody's working together, and those that don't feel like they can do something directly can like give help action or guidance or any of those things to one of the other characters that does have a good idea of something that they can do, and try to give them this idea that they can do, oh, there's all this sort of like clever play, all this extra stuff that you can do, to try to give some more texture to encounters, and try to provide encounters that are not just straightforward combats, and aren't things that when they're not combats that can just be waved away with a single die roll. So kind of these three things together really sort of elevating my games in a very quick and very sort of effective way. And they're all really easy to implement. Like morale is just a simple check that you make during the combat at the start of the bad guy's turn. Things like random encounters is just something you check when players are kind of screwing around in a dungeon or an overland sense, and then you don't feel like they're kind of stalling out and they're not making forward progression, or they're taking too much time, or they're being a little too casual with the stuff that's kind of going on. And then effort's very simple when you're like, I want to make a non-combat encounter. I can take an existing sort of trap or hazard with a DC and then decide how many checks that I want to make out of that. I usually like 3, 5, or 7. Those kind of feel right. Those feel very skill challenge adjacent, and sort of pick those and kind of go on from there. But yeah, those are sort of the 3 things that I found super effective. I don't know if you've used any of these. If you have, sure, and like let me know. These 3 things made a huge difference in the quality of my games. Made the games more engaging because it force the players to make more sort of decisions and be very calculated and thoughtful about the decisions that they make and the consequences of those decisions. It was just very simple to implement for me, and I noticed that the quality of my games just went like boop, really easily. And there are also things that I don't see necessarily, especially in sort of 5th edition, I don't see a lot of other dungeon masters kind of use. If you have any other sort of like easy, quick tricks or tips that helped you improve your dungeon master or game master craft, share them in the comments below. If you want to know more about these topics, and be sure to like and subscribe. I think next time we're gonna get back to the solo RPG, so definitely check that out if you haven't yet. We just passed a milestone. We just had our 40th session, which is insane to think about considering how far we've gone. We are in the middle of a dungeon delve. It is going okay. We are not doing a great job, but we're also not doing a not great job. But that's going to be it for me, guys. I've had a ton of fun, and I will see you guys next time. Alright, bye.